In the United Church of Christ, one can find a great variety of worship styles and traditions. They reflect the traditions from which the various predecessor groups emerged. They reflect a variety of cultural traditions as different racial and ethnic communities have joined the United Church of Christ. And they reflect the influences of the ecumenical movement and ecumenical engagement over the last several years. One can go to a New England meeting house built in the 18th century and see a high pulpit worship, which is very formal, focused on preaching, choir anthems, and so forth, or just in a neighboring community, an African American congregation, which is very Afrocentric traditions, pulsing rhythms, a strong blending together in the sermons of powerful intellectual as well as powerful emotional dimensions. Some of our churches are experimenting with informal contemporary services using praise music and different kinds of instrumentation. One can go to California or Hawaii and find Micronesian or Samoan worshiping communities that reflect both the missionary heritage of the London Missionary Society and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission, which founded those congregations, but also rich ethnic traditional music that evokes the culture and the ethos of the islands. There are the high liturgies in some of our German Reformed background churches that reflect the Mercersburg tradition with a very strong sacramental dimension to them, or lively Hispanic prayer and praise services. So wherever one goes, one is going to expect to find a diverse and varied experience. But there are some common threads, some common themes that I hope we can explore in this week's session. One of them is the influence over the last 40 years of a number of things which have really helped to shape and revitalize worship in the United Church of Christ. The first is the broad liturgical renewal movement that emerged first in the Roman Catholic Church out of Vatican II. Important liturgical reforms, which also inspired a great deal of liturgical scholarship and study, going back to sources, back to roots in the ancient church, recovering old traditions and implementing them in a variety of styles and ways across different denominations. The United Church of Christ participated in that through what was called the Consultation on Common Texts, which was an English language section of an international consultation extending over many, many years, even decades, which brought together scholars, liturgists, and worship planners to reflect together on ways to witness to the unity of the church in the midst of our worship life. This included the development of common prayers, liturgies, lectionaries, and hymns. The ecumenical engagement in general has brought the United Church of Christ into contact with a variety of traditions that have all become influential in one degree or another. We've learned mutually from one another just within the United Church of Christ, as Congregationalists learn from German Reformed and Christians from evangelicals and so forth. Beyond the mutual learning occurred in broader ecumenical engagement and increasingly also in interfaith engagement. One can see in some of our congregations the influences from rituals of other faith traditions. In the 60s and 70s, the Consultation on Church Union, a 9-member ecumenical initiative, created some common liturgical materials, including a Koku liturgy, a liturgy that shaped a baptismal and a Eucharistic worship together. The United Church of Christ and our Disciples Partnership brought us into encounter with a tradition that practiced adult baptism and that also practiced weekly communion. And so those conversations became influential, and as pastors moved back and forth from one to the other, some of those influences began to seep into our common life. Probably the most influential is a document you'll be reading part of this week called Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, or BEM. It was produced by the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches in 1982, the product of decades of work together that looked at how the churches could understand the theology of baptism, the theology of Eucharist or communion, and the theology of ministry together. That process continued after the publication of BEM with responses from many of the 300 member churches, the World Council of Churches, and the Roman Catholic Church. And those documents have begun to shape the worship materials of many denominations, including the United Church of Christ. The final ecumenical engagement I'll mention is the Lutheran Reformed dialogue process, which began in the late 60s and continued on into the 1990s, ultimately resulting in a formula of agreement and another document called A Common Calling that became the basis for votes by all of our churches, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the Reformed Church in America, to enter into a full communion agreement. And that dialogue focused heavily on the sacrament of Holy Communion, in large measure because that was the divisive issue reaching all the way back to the time of the Reformation, indeed to the Marburg Colloquy in 1529 between Luther and Zwingli. As we look together at how we understood Christ's presence in the communion experience, how differing understandings could be seen rather not as contradictory, but rather as perhaps complementary. The women's movement has played an important role in the United Church of Christ in liturgical renewal. The use of inclusive language has really grown across the denomination, and not only has shaped how we understand our human relationships, but also how we understand God. And it's not simply a matter of using gender-neutral language, but also finding rich new metaphors and images for God, often out of Scripture, sometimes out of the theological traditions that have been lost or even suppressed over the years. The key texts that have resulted out of these experiences and this ecumenical work and liturgical renewal has been the Book of Worship of the United Church of Christ, 1986, and the New Century Hymnal, published in the 1990s. Book of Worship is not used solely by all of our congregations, but increasingly it is the norm against which congregations exercise and carry out their liturgical freedom and their liturgical responsibilities. So it becomes a basis from which to work, and in many congregations you'll see elements of Book of Worship, and the theology of Book of Worship also begins to find its way into the liturgies of our congregations. The New Century Hymnal produced a hymnal, somewhat controversial at the time, in which inclusive language was used very significantly throughout the hymnal. Many new images and metaphors for God were used, and also learnings on cosmology, learnings about the way in which persons with disabilities can be marginalized, learning about the ways in which color and light can be described in ways that diminish or demean different racial and ethnic groups, all began to reshape how we thought about the texts of our hymns. And the New Century Hymnal introduced a full psalter, the opportunity to chant the Psalms, followed the church year, and is keyed closely to the common lectionary. So some of these other liturgical reforms over the last 40 years are also seen in the New Century Hymnal. The story for the United Church of Christ in terms of worship and sacraments, I think, could best be described as experimentation and accountability. Experimentation, finding new and bold and cutting-edge ways to worship the Holy One, and at the same time accountability, both to the great tradition and also to our ecumenical partners and colleagues. Sometimes this moves us into tension with each other, but also leads to a rich and vibrant and vital worship. Your focus this week is on sacraments, but sacraments are always set within the larger worship context. So I hope you will find this week engaging, and I look forward to reading the liturgies that you're going to be producing this week.